This story took place in 1941, during the Romanian occupation of Ukraine, and is 100% real. There are various documents detailing these events, as well as testimony from Captain George Popescu, who is one of those involved heavily in this event. All documents pertaining to these events were classified and were only made publicly available during the end of the 90s. Captain George Popescu heard rumors about some kind of vampire on his first day in Odessa. The orderly captain, who was born in Privas and was brought from there to here in order to assist with some top-secret cases that needed to be handled quickly and quietly. He was enlisted into the secret police, and the ruling forces were hoping to resolve and quell these rumors before massive unrest set in. These rumors were about a mysterious night killer who kidnapped people right from the streets. Their completely bloodless corpses were later found near the Odessa catacombs, and sometimes they were not even found at all. Over the past month, about 24 people had disappeared: Romanians, Germans, and local policemen. Nobody counted how many civilians from Odessa were missing, but they say it was also quite a lot. The captain did not believe any of the chatter. The commandant's office warned him that he should not walk around Odessa at night unless absolutely necessary. The reason given, though, was not the vampires, but rebels and assassins. He did not even try to dissuade the orderly. It would be better for him to sit at home in the evenings, keep order, and not wander around in search of local beauties. The next day, having received a new assignment, Popescu no longer knew whether to laugh or to cry. The captain was offered service in Siguranza in a special squad to investigate the mysterious death of military personnel. Siguranza, the Romanian secret service, akin to the German Gestapo, was not popular among the officers, but Popescu had no choice. Moreover, he still remained on staff, and thus did not lose honor. Siguranza needed a medievalist, and she found an infantry captain recovering from injury who had taught history at the Bucharest Lyceum before the war. She found Popescu and called him to the Odessa. This was, however, much more preferable than being sent back to the front lines to starve and die in an instant. 3 days later, he was no longer sure whether this was still the case. At the front, at least everything was clear. At the front, there were friends all around. The enemy is on the opposite side, and you know exactly what you have to do. Here, the enemy was completely unknown, and what to do next and how to find them was impossible to determine. Even though the very existence was beyond doubt, this just made it even harder. Popescu had to examine new victims. These victims were 2 local police officers. Both were found dead at the entrance to Hades. That's the nickname for one of the catacombs, almost in the very center of the city. At the autopsy, it was determined that the cause of death was colossal blood loss. The victims lost almost every drop of blood from their bodies, but no traces of blood were found at the discovery site. No blood was found on the uniforms either. And most importantly, there were no wounds on the bodies themselves. The only thing that attracted attention was the multiple rashes on the bodies of the dead, similar to what happens with rubella. Pinkish-bluish nodules the size of a pinhead covered the skin of each killed policeman. A similar rash was found in other victims, but the infectious disease doctor who arrived at Popescu's insistence had difficulty making a diagnosis. The story that they were using to explain these mysterious deaths about the rebels and assassins had to be revised. If those men were murdered, then how? From time to time, the partisans, of course, made forays, but their style was simple and not difficult to decipher. It would be a bullet, a grenade, a knife. In addition, the dead were left with money, documents, and even weapons still on their bodies, which the partisans would certainly have taken. The Siguranza was staffed by people who, at heart, remained superstitious peasants, and therefore, they only became convinced that everything that happened was the work of a vampire. Whether he bit into the victims with his teeth, or sucked out blood in some other way, it did not matter to them. Even more people not allowed to participate in the investigation conveyed chilling details about the case that they discovered. About 2 wounds on the body of each killed, about a huge black bat allegedly repeatedly seen on moonlit Odessa nights, about the fact that the catacombs under the city have access to almost every single basement, and therefore, no one can feel safe, even in their own homes. Silver rapidly increased in price and became even more expensive than gold. Everyone wanted to hang a silver chain or crucifix around their neck as protection against vampires. It was considered especially necessary to have a clip of silver bullets. Those who could not afford silver filled their flasks with holy water and chewed garlic all day. Colonel Sadovanu, deputy commander of the Odessa Siguranza Directorate, directly asked Popescu how well founded the rumors about a vampire were and what, according to science, should be done in this case. The captain reported that it was too early to draw any conclusions. He said that it was possible that there is an epidemic of an unknown disease in the city. The enemy could be using special bacteriological weapons. Another version is poison. They could have been using poison. Soldiers could have been quite easily poisoned in the taverns that have proliferated recently. And finally, it was possible that a maniac was operating alone, or maybe even a wild animal. Colonel Sadovanu asked Captain Popescu if this meant that he completely denies any possibility of the existence of a vampire, and that the rumor should be put to bed permanently. Popescu replied no. He said that he was completely and utterly sure that vampires really did exist, and maybe still did exist in the modern day. He put forward, however, that vampires are not supernatural creatures, and instead, just only a certain subspecies of a person endowed with special properties. It is still possible to catch him, just like any regular human, but it will require people and time, lots of time. In the meantime, precautions around the city should be tightened. The Siguranza knew just how to tighten measures. The curfew began before sunset and ended after sunrise. A group of at least 5 people was allowed to move around at night. At the slightest threat of an attack, they should open fire to kill. In all the houses where Allied soldiers were quartered, the basements had to be inspected. They also promised a carrot. A reward was offered for information about the attackers hiding in the catacombs, as well as for information about the catacombs themselves. These catacombs were a headache for the Siguranza. It was not possible to find any of their schemes. Either it was destroyed during the Russian retreat, or it did not exist at all. Below, underground, anything could happen, and this created uncertainty that the Siguranza wanted to avoid at all costs. The orders were of some use. In the Berwinitz casino, they found the entrance to the dungeon, and in it were dozens of barrels of strong grape vodka. War is war, and smuggling is smuggling. Several criminals who plied their trade on the night streets of Odessa were also detained. The partisans hid the best that they could. The Siguranza, however, did not stand on ceremony. Everyone detained during the curfew was declared a partisan and an enemy of the Siguranza, no matter who they actually were. This helped to persuade those who were not actually enemies to adhere to the curfew so that the vampire could be properly detained. The vampire waited for about a week without doing anything at all. Then he struck out of nowhere. 3 Romanian infantrymen were found near Hades, resting in the city after being discharged from the hospital. The picture is still the same. A rash all over the body, complete bleeding, and the absence of fresh wounds. Captain Popescu suggested going down into the catacombs, and Sadovanu promised to think about it. For some reason, the usually decisive colonel was not enthusiastic about this idea. This confirmed Popescu's worst suspicions. The captain believed that vampirism is a kind of game of nature and occurs from the influence of some as of yet unknown natural factors on a person, perhaps while still in the womb, and therefore, mentions of vampires are found more often in some areas, rarely in others, and in others, such a phenomenon is not known at all. So, according to the captain, the vampire was not local. They brought it with them from Romania. During the day, he is a soldier, an officer, anyone at all. But at night, he gives up his disguise and strikes where no one can see him coming. A day later, 2 German soldiers became victims. It was necessary to do something urgently so as to not look like weak-hearted incompetence in the eyes of the Allies. The raid was carried out on a grand scale. About 30 soldiers in total descended into Hades at once, and in total, They examined more than 20 entrances at the same time, using 2 battalions. Popescu had never seen a more stupid operation. They walked in, as if going for a leisurely walk. The proximity of their comrades gave courage to even the most cowardly of them, but as soon as they went a few dozen steps underground, the fun had disappeared from them, and they were not so enthusiastic anymore. In addition, it turned out that the electric flashlights provided were fading before their eyes. They were afraid to light torches because of the possible encounter with methane gas down in the catacombs, and therefore they had to turn back very suddenly and without achieving their goal. Popescu had no losses, but in other units, several people did not return from the dungeon. It is unlikely that the vampire was to blame this time. In a panic that followed the sudden darkness, everyone's lights went out almost simultaneously. Someone started shooting. Someone then returned fire in their direction, and if not for the decisive order to retreat, the losses would have been catastrophic. The soldiers were way too on edge. Everything, of course, was attributed to the partisans in the reports, saying that as a result of the operation, the enemy underground was defeated. But the Allies were not satisfied with this result. They decided to make a foray into Hades on their own, and Colonel Sadovanu had to convince the Allies to take Popescu into the detachment. It was clear at first glance that the Germans were solid and reliable people. They sent experienced miners and 1 speleologist to their small detachment of 7 people. They took miners' lamps, 2 lanterns for each, with a supply of fresh batteries, sea torches, those that burn even when wet, hooks, ropes, wall markers, and they dressed like chimney sweepers, in all black. Black knitted caps were pulled over their heads, leaving only the eyes and mouth exposed. They decided to go to the catacombs, not during the day, but at night. They gave the reason that the time of the day did not matter, as that would not change the lighting situation that they would face down under there. However, the enemy was one that operated only under the cover of night, so perhaps he would be active down there if they went at that time. The Germans accepted Popescu. They didn't need a Romanian vampire specialist, but stripes for wounds and the Iron Cross, which Romanians were awarded extremely rarely, made them look at the captain with a lot of respect. Having assessed the uniforms of the Allies, Popescu asked for the same for himself. Comfortable, and in difficult situations, uncomfortable uniforms and poor equipment can often cost lives. In the evening, they conducted a detailed briefing, repeating all possible actions in the event of an enemy attack, coordinating interaction in critical situations in advance. Popescu was politely told that it was his job to give advice only if asked. Don't rush forward, but don't lag behind either. Do not shoot without being absolutely sure that there is an enemy in front of him. By midnight, the van with the detachment arrived at Hades. A dozen German soldiers were already there, watching the black hole. Nothing unusual. The lieutenant reported that everything was completely quiet. Now the entrance to the catacombs was barely visible in the light of the crescent moon, and people, completely dressed in black, disappeared into the darkness. Popescu was next to last, and the chain was closed by a sergeant who had worked for several years on the construction of the Berlin metro before the war. The lights were turned on only inside, and their light seemed especially bright. The first meters, familiar to Popescu, passed slowly, adapting to the topography of the former quarry. The nightmare began when they passed the fork. Having chosen the first branch, the detachment entered a low, long move, and here they had to walk carefully, because corpses lay everywhere, mummified bodies of policemen and soldiers. Only once did they see the corpse of a woman. Popescu counted 11 bodies. He was shocked, but the Germans moved forward. Their nerves were either stronger than his, or they were just numb to it all. The passage widened, and they were able to straighten up. This did not bring relief at all. Popescu felt the pressure of the overhanging rock almost physically, but suddenly, a light appeared ahead, and they involuntarily rushed towards it. The sergeant who was walking in front held him back, and with a gesture, ordered him not to move from his place. There was no way it could be natural light. It was night all around. The light was bluish, which deceived Popescu at first, but after a few steps, it became clear that it was too blue for daylight. Suddenly, weakness washed over Popescu. He made every effort to stay on his feet, but failed and fell softly, the pistol and flashlight falling from his hands. The others lasted longer, but only for a few seconds. Someone fired a burst from a machine gun, but Popescu did not see where or who they shot at. He could only lie still. Several minutes of silence gave way to a barely audible hiss. The light intensified. Suddenly, a desperate groan was heard, and again, there was a few minutes of silence. Another moan was heard again. This happened again and again, several more times. Popescu heard a groan, and every time he understood that it was a man dying. But why? Curiosity fought with fear in his mind. Finally, Popescu saw a luminous mass in front of him, most reminiscent of a huge sponge. It crawled like a continuous carpet through the cave, getting closer and closer to Popescu. He closed his eyes. It was as if thousands of ants were running along it, biting the skin along the way. But the bite was not painful at all. It was even pleasant. The old wound, the pain of which he had already gotten used to, stopped aching. If this is death, then death is pleasant. Over time, the bites became fewer and fewer. When Popescu decided to open his eyes, he saw only the light from the unextinguished lanterns. Gradually, he was able to control himself so much that he knelt down, and a little later rose to his full height. A German sergeant barely moved in front. The rest lay motionless. Popescu briefly examined the bodies and realized that 6 were dead, and the sergeant was very weak. The captain himself could barely hold on, and then for a long time could not understand how he had the strength not only to get out of the cave, but also to pull the sergeant out on himself. He lost consciousness only outside at the entrance to Hades. Popescu woke up a day later. He gave a full account of what happened in the cave, and his assessment of what happened to Colonel Sadovano, who was standing by the bed. In his opinion, a certain creature lives in the catacombs, perhaps a distant relative of the sea sponge. This creature is predatory, paralyzing the victim in an unknown way. It sucks the blood out of it. The creature is capable of movement, and, when hungry, sneaks to the exit of the quarry, where it lies in wait for prey. The corpses in the cave itself suggest that the creature is capable of luring its victims inside. He does not know where the creature came from. It could have come from the sea. The catacombs communicate with it. It could have come from the very depths of the earth. It could have been developed by Russian biologists as a result of experiments. It is also unknown whether this creature is one or many, whether it is growing, and if so, how quickly. He believes that further exploration of the catacombs should be prohibited until more favorable times. Then, after the war, it will be possible to take the catacombs seriously. Now it is better to wall up the entrances, involving the local population in this, and explaining to them the danger of the catacombs. Popescu's recommendations were partially implemented. They walled up, blew up the only known exits from the catacombs, presenting it as a fight against partisans. True, they continued to inflict brutal blows on the occupiers and disappeared to God knows where. Soon, the Red Army went out on the offensive, and the losses of the Romanians and their allies began to number in the hundreds of thousands. They had no time for the underground vampire. Greater Romania was rapidly shrinking, losing the conquered lands with amazing speed. For his participation in the rescue of the sergeant, Captain George Popescu managed to receive oak leaves for his Iron Cross. After the war, until 1955, he was in captivity and worked on the restoration of Soviet cities. Upon his release, he lived in Bucharest, at one time taught at universities, and came to the Soviet Union twice, in 1969 and 1971. During the overthrow of the Ceausescu regime in 1989, he went missing, and no trace of him was ever found again. I've got a pretty long one that I think I'm ready to tell. I have looked here for years on and off, but never noticed the ghost story threads until now for whatever reason. It's a good 10 pages in MS Word, so I'll break it up into chunks to make it a bit more digestible. The first part is mostly setup and doesn't get weird till the end, so I'll preface it with a little gem of wisdom my grandmother once gave me about nightlights to get into the swing of things and make this post at least worth something. Like many young children, I slept with a nightlight. We had one in the hall and the bathroom too for night journeys. One summer, my grandmother came to live with us and took up residence in the room next to mine. I'm not sure why she told me this, but I distinctly remember her saying, just before bedtime one night, she said, "You shouldn't use a nightlight." I, of course, asked why. She looked at me, dead serious, and said, "They only let the devil see you better." Needless to say, I never slept with one again, and I hated the one out in the hallway, just enough to shut my door at night. I was probably all of 8 years old at the time. Thanks, Grandma. Okay, on to the main story. This is an event that happened to my ex-girlfriend and myself, along with a few of our friends, about 11 years ago. We were all in high school at the time. Juniors, all of us, but my younger brother, who was a freshman, and his older sophomore friend. I had a thing for haunted places, though honestly, I really hadn't done much more than explore some supposedly haunted, abandoned house out in the sticks. Nothing doing there. My girlfriend, we'll call her Katie for the sake of privacy, was also mildly into the whole paranormal thing, as were a couple of my friends and my younger bro, Mark. As the story goes, my mother discovered that I was into these kinds of things, and sure enough, so was she. She really enjoyed the whole idea of ghosts and ghouls and such. None of us had really done anything though. That is to say, we'd never actually gone out to a cemetery or haunted house except for me and two of my friends. Now, at this time of her life, my mother liked to smoke when things got stressful. However, she tried not to do it too often, and she never did it in front of anyone else. It was her little secret, even though my brother and I knew it was going on. She'd sneak into the bathroom and turn on the overhead fan and open a window and puff a couple out. We'd always smell it sooner or later, but we played it cool. She could be drinking, we figured, so a little cigarette here or there was better than some of the alternatives. Anyways, around that time, she was on the verge of divorcing our cheating stepfather as well, so things were pretty tense on the home front. He was indeed cheating, and she eventually did divorce him, but after she found out, she allowed him to prove himself, if you will, by ending the affair. Anyways, she'd occasionally just get so stressed with work and her cheating husband, and surely of making dinner and cleaning the house and working late at her lovely job and all the other stuff moms do for their families, that she'd just hop in the car and take off. She'd always tell us when she left, and eventually, we got used to it. She'd essentially just drive around for a couple of hours, usually out in the boonies, and smoke. It was her way of letting off some major steam. After one of these drives, she came home all excited. She was always in a much better mood after a drive, so at first, I didn't think much of it. But she kept looking at me like she wanted to tell me something, like she wanted to get something off of her chest. But she was smiling about it, so I knew it wasn't anything terrible. Finally, I asked her what was driving her up so much. She leaned in close, and the smell of cigarettes on her breath, mingled with mouthwash, was overpowering, but I stayed put all the same. I found an old abandoned school, she said. At first I didn't get it. So what? A school, out in the boonies, and it was abandoned? And then it clicked. She leaned back and smiled. You want to check it out? My interest was immediately piqued. Of course I did. However, I couldn't quite accept that my mother was just going to go let me traipsing around some abandoned building, far away from any form of civilization, even if she was chaperoning. I hesitantly nodded, but voiced my aforementioned misgivings about the matter. She promptly said that she knew exactly where it was, and that as long as I took a handful of friends, and we all had cell phones, charged, and plenty of flashlights, and a decent first aid kit, she didn't mind my checking it out. I could hardly believe it. When she'd found out about my former adventure in the not-so-haunted house in the sticks, she'd nearly launched into the stratosphere. She'd taken away my car from me for a month. She had paid for it, after all, and I had to ride the damn bus to school, which was a major shock to my high school junior ego. So here it was, the answer to my previous longings to do something. All I had to do was let her know about it. Of course, that seems obvious now, but as a teen, The last thing I wanted to do was tell my mom I might be getting into some trouble. So she agrees to allow me to visit the site, but of course, she lays on the mother pretty thick. If anything at all goes wrong, even a scratch on some rusty metal, she is to be called immediately. Also, all the other parents of my friends involved must be aware of our little outing as well. This was the gotcha. None of my friends' parents would agree to such an excursion, especially not Katie's. However, my mother didn't ask us to prove all was well with the other parents, so we never asked them. Perhaps a bad decision in the long run, but again, we were all teens. And just because my mother was suddenly open to the idea of us mucking around inside some possibly haunted, but mostly nature-overrun school, none of my peers' parents were likely to be. So, we didn't tell them, and Mom did not ask. We decided to visit the school on a Saturday. It would give us plenty of time to check the place out, and we were all hoping that we might actually be able to spend the night there, with a quick call to our parents, of course. The plan was to all pile into the van of one of the guys coming along, Joe was his name, and head out around noon. We'd go eat lunch someplace first, and then make our way out there, placing us at the school around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This way, we figured, we could argue that we'd not had enough time, and we might as well stay the night, if we could. And of course, we'd only really be calling my mother. I felt certain that she'd let us stay as long as our rules were obeyed. We headed out, grabbed a quick lunch, and got to the place close to the designated time. All was well. My mother had been right when she said that the place was way out there. There was nothing for miles around but cornfields dotted with thick tangles of woods. None of us could fathom why there would be a school so far away from anything. I later found out that there had been a one-street town there, within shouting distance of the school in fact. It had been abandoned after a fire had gutted most of it, sparing the school, some 40 years previous. None of us knew this at the time. Otherwise, we might have widened our search, but there were apparently a few old houses and remains of the one street and such in the newly grown woods in the area. We just figured it was a schoolhouse for the farm kids, back in the olden times, before we were but a twinkling in our mother's eye. For the first hour or so, we mostly stuck to checking out the perimeter of the school. It wasn't massive, but it wasn't tiny either. It was a good 3 stories high, rectangular in shape, probably had at least 20 to 25 good-sized rooms in it, including administrative offices and such. It had probably served most of the region, as the city I'd grown up in had been tiny back when the place was built, as were all the surrounding hamlets. I discovered all of this upon doing some research at the public library shortly after our little excursion out to the place. I didn't find many records for the building, which I thought was strange, but what I did find indicated that it was the main school for some 50 miles in all directions, and the town it was built in had apparently burned to the ground. The school was saved, but most of the town's survivors simply moved to one of the neighboring hamlets, which by then were growing enough to warrant building their own schools. So, this one gradually fell into disrepair and was forgotten. It was terribly overgrown, with vines, bushes, even trees. The western corner was dominated by a massive oak that seemed to have grown right up alongside the building, destroying much of the exterior as it grew. None of the windows had any glass in them, not even shards. There was a bit of graffiti, but it was noticeably scarce. The place was truly off the beaten path. None of us had heard of it from anyone else, and there were plenty of similar places, old houses, shacks in the woods, etc., in the area that teens ventured out to. The road, if you would call it that we drove down to get to the place, was completely overgrown, never been paved. At least that much was clear. We had to park the van halfway down it due to a couple of several-year-old trees growing in the middle of it. You could see some of the school from the main road that we took to get there. Of course, it was barely wide enough for 2 cars, and looked like it hadn't seen any maintenance in a decade. Joe was not happy about all the potholes he had to caress his van through. The place didn't initially seem all that daunting to me. It looked like a semi-modern school that had been left alone for a few decades, and Mother Nature had done her thing. I didn't get goosebumps looking at it, and as far as I can remember, no one mentioned anything about being creeped out by the place when we first arrived. I was really kind of unimpressed by it at first. Our initial search revealed very little. There were remains of a playground area behind the school, mostly just rusted playground equipment, a lot of it unrecognizable due to its advanced state of degradation. We did notice what looked like a dilapidated old house, 1 story tall, and probably no more than 3 or 4 rooms, off in the distance, but we decided to leave it be for the time being, focusing on the school. The front entryway was completely overgrown with vines. Most of the building was covered in them. My grandfather owns a house in the town I grew up in near there with a similar vine problem. He actually mostly lives in Florida, but spends some time in town to make sure his sons are keeping his family business tip-top. Every summer, he has to either have one of my uncles or a hired crew come and trim down the vines growing all over his house. It's a yearly battle, and the few summers he's simply let it go led to nothing but damage to the gutters and windows of the house. The vines growing all around the school were the same kind, ones that you might find on some stately manor, giving it an air of age and pomp. Of course, these vines had seen no attention for years, and were really doing a job on the exterior of the place. What little we could see of the actual exterior was made of limestone and granite, 2 very abundant rocks in that region. Adam, another of my friends along for the trip, had fought to bring machetes. Otherwise, we would have had a hard time getting into the place. He had 3 of them with him, and distributed them amongst our small group. He had 1. Alex, a friend of my brother's, had 1, and I also had 1. My brother, Katie, and Joe were equipped with pretty powerful flashlights. We decided that we'd split up into pairs as we explored the place. We all had flashlights of some kind, and at least one of us would have a machete in case some homeless guy or wild animal decided to attack. So, after a look around the outside, we hacked our way through the front doors. The doors themselves were long gone. The clearing of the entry took longer than we expected. We could see the gap, and the vines did not cover it completely, but they were tough as hell. Finally, we cleared a hole and headed in. We were immediately met by the smell of an ancient, rotting building. I wish we had brought some kind of masks or something, because the place was surely toxic. The walls were warped and caving in with mildew and water damage. The floors were slimy in some places, crusty in others, but all around fragile. It's a wonder none of us stepped through any of them. The front hall was in pretty bad shape. We figured because it had been open to a good deal of exposure with the doors missing. We didn't notice any remnants of them, come to think of it. They were just gone. Most of us had enough sense to bring at least 1 extra set of clothing with us, except for my younger brother. After hacking our way into the front entry, we backed out to retrieve a shirt or some such to wrap around our noses and mouths. They weren't perfect, and you could still smell the place through them, but they were better than nothing. My brother, being the douche that he can be sometimes, decided that he didn't need anything anyways, and refused to wrap a t-shirt of mine around his face. I gave it to him regardless, and he stuffed it in his back pocket, most of it hanging out, just in case, he said. By this time, it was getting into late afternoon. The month was early October, so the light was going to be failing soon, but we have enough time to get a good lay of the land before we'd have to rely solely on our flashlights. The interior was dim, but not dark. We split up. Me and Katie were together, of course. My brother and his friend Alex, and Joe and Adam are the final pair. Katie and I decide to head to the top floor. My brother and Alex take the middle, and Joe and Adam poke around the ground floor, with the idea that we'd all meet up in an hour or so at the entryway again, and each take a different floor. This way, we'd all get to see the whole place before it got too dark, and we could decide upon a good place to crash for the night, or whether or not it was a good idea to do so at all. So, we all head out, Luckily, the stairs had been made of concrete, at least the ones at the entry, so going up to the top floor was not difficult, though the stairs were strewn with several decades worth of debris from storms and peeling ceilings and walls. Katie and I made it to the top floor without too much trouble and started moving through the school. The place was interesting, to say the least. Most of the classrooms still had desks and cabinets and such in them. In the few that we could open, however, we didn't find anything but rust, mold, and rot. I felt no heebie-jeebies while I was there, at least not till the end. Even Katie remarked that the place was not what she expected. I don't recall hearing any weird sounds that weren't explainable by the creaks and groans of an ancient building, nor did I see anything strange. No children running past the doorway, no old school moms eliciting rage upon their former pupils, no Silent Hill-esque monsters looming out of the shadows. Of course, that was the case at first. Then, for some inexplicable reason, Katie simply disappeared. I say she disappeared because one minute I was checking out the corner of some moldy room. The next, I was asking her what she thought of some huge hole in the wall that looked out of place, and she did not respond. I looked around, and she wasn't with me anymore. At first, I didn't panic. She'd simply stepped back out into the hallway again, on to the next room. I called for her. No answer. One of the reasons I dig Katie was that she could play a good practical joke. I was the type of guy who loved pulling one over on a buddy or whoever, and Katie was the first girl I ever dated that actually enjoyed the occasional prank and loved to one-up me whenever she could. So, of course, I figured she's about to spook my rear end. Nothing to worry about. She'll jump out at me any second, or feign being injured or whatever to unnerve me. So I call out for her again, kind of playful, like I'm onto her. No answer. Typical, I think to myself. She's just reeling me in. I leave the room I'm in and make my way to the next, glancing over my shoulder every few moments to try to catch her sneaking up on me. I never see her. The next room is empty. The room after that is empty as well. 2 rooms later, and I'm at a fungus-covered wall at the end of the hallway, praying that the shirt wrapped around my face will keep all of the nastiness out. I check the last 2 rooms there at the end of the hall, and she is still not around. Now I'm starting to feel the beginnings of anxiety. Usually by this point, she would have sprung her trap on me, but no dice. So I carefully backtrack, searching every room again, opening closets where they actually still had hanging doors, looking under rusting and rotting desks, glancing through vine-infested windows to make sure she's not outside, looking up with a grin on her face. She is simply nowhere to be found. I checked the entire top floor as thoroughly as I could. I'm thinking, by this point, that I need to do what Mom asked me to do. Call her if anything goes wrong. But I just know that Katie is playing a prank on me. She has to be. How could she just disappear? She had to be somewhere, and wherever that was, she was probably laughing her rear end off about it. But my gut was churning, and something was definitely wrong. I held off on calling Mom. I figured Katie might have headed back downstairs and outside to do the necessary or something. I found it strange that she wouldn't have said anything to me about it, but this place was obviously toxic. Maybe she had just gotten sick and just couldn't stay long enough to say, "Hey, I'm out." So, I headed down to the second level along the main stairwell. There were at least 2 other stairwells going down from each end of the hall at the top level, but I figured I'd have a better chance of catching her down the main one, as the side ones were wooden and did not look safe at all. I found Mark and Alex on the second floor, and they hadn't seen Katie either. Neither of them looked like they were faking to prolong the prank, and Alex actually looked upset. I didn't take the time to ask him what was up, and instead started shouting out Katie's name. By now, I'm getting pretty worried and hoping to hell this better pan out is just one hell of a trick on her part. Still no answer. My brother and Alex and I all head down to the ground floor after a cursory look in all the rooms on the second floor, all pretty worried about Katie. After a few minutes of searching, we find Joe and Adam, and they seem to be pretty bored with the place. They ask what the other floors look like, before we get a chance to mention Katie's disappearance. My bro and Alex just shrug, while I blurt out, "Where's Katie?" They both look at each other, and then back at me with blank stares. Joe starts to crack a grin, and suddenly, I feel better and angry all at once. Surely he's in on it, and just can't hold it back any longer. He's about to tell me she's waiting in some closet somewhere close, and I just have to keep looking, so I can get the shit scared out of me by my girlfriend. The joke was going to be, after all, on me. He asked me if I'm kidding him. I freak out and say of course not. He doesn't get it, and I suddenly get very angry. I'm confused and worried, and this prick is seemingly playing around with me. I'd had enough of the joke, and was about ready to pound his face. He suddenly realized I wasn't kidding, and got really pale. Said he didn't know where she was. Asked if I'd looked everywhere. Of course I had, I told him, but surely I had not. I realized that this place could have a basement. It was then that we heard the scream. It was like nothing I've ever heard before in my life. It was obviously Katie, but I've never before or since heard anyone scream in that kind of terror. It sent my body into animal mode. Every muscle tensed up, from my rear end cheeks to the cheeks on my face. For a moment, all any of us could do was stand there and listen to this banshee wail of a scream. It was petrifying. And then another came. By the time Katie had screamed a third time, I was on the move. Halfway down the main hallway, I heard what sounded like a large heavy door slam shut. She must have screamed another half dozen times before I finally found her, at the bottom of the stairwell, a level below the ground floor. The entrance to the basement. Okay, I'll go ahead and post the last two parts. Figured I'd spread them out a bit for the sake of sanity, but I guess I'll cut to the chase. Here is the second part of our misadventure, the third to follow on its heels. Things, of course, got very strange at this point. The stairs, as I mentioned earlier, were wooden here and looked completely unsafe. I hesitated, but only for a moment, as Katie screamed again, before heading down them as lightly as I could. It was also, obviously, pretty dark near the bottom of the stairwell. All three of the upper stories of it were lined with windows, but they had been mostly covered over by the vines on this part of the building, so the whole place was dim. I flicked my flashlight on as I made my way down the one flight to the basement landing, but did not immediately see Katie anywhere. She let out a gurgle of a scream, and then another real peeler. I wondered if her wailing might not bring the stairs down from under me. Finally, I get to the bottom. The other guys are all clustered at the top of the first floor landing, looking down at me with pale faces and nervous eyes. None of them seemed willing to follow me down. For the moment, I didn't really care. I just wanted to find Katie and get the hell out. And from the sound of her screams, she was right there with me. A quick look around the landing revealed that it was just that. A doorway was built into the wall to my right as I left the stairs. The corner of the building was in front of me. There was a little stretch of concrete floor in front of the door that led to a corner on my right. Katie was seemingly over there somewhere. I flashed the light and saw her huddled in the corner where the stairwell came down, as far from the door as she could get. The light obviously startled her because she let out another scream. I started towards her, but she got visibly more shaken the closer I got. It was as if she didn't see me. I say see me rather than recognize me, because she really seemed to be looking through me, but not at my face. Clearly though, she could see me approaching, so it was pretty unnerving. I slowly squat down next to her, and she is moaning the whole time, still looking through me and not at me. She starts slapping me and scratching me like some wild animal, screaming and kicking and lashing out. She knocked me on my rear end, and I went sprawling towards the door. Her eyes got really wide, like she was either finally recognizing me, or something worse was going on in her head, and started moaning again. Her hair was a mess, and her clothing looked like it had been torn and was filthy in places. So, she is clearly out of her mind. Instead of approaching her, I start talking to her, telling her that it's just me, her boyfriend, that everything will be alright, that nothing is going to hurt her, there's nothing to worry about. After a few minutes of this, she seems to calm down a bit, and finally stops looking through me and at me. Suddenly and finally, she recognizes me and just starts sobbing at me. I'm moving close, and she hugs me to her, babbling through her tears about something on the other side of the door. I don't want to stick around, and of course, I need to get her out of there, so I didn't mess around. I picked her up and trudged up the stairs as fast as I could. She was basically wrapped around me like a little frightened kid the whole time. Her legs locked around my waist, her arms around my neck, and holding me in a vice grip. Finally, I get her to the top of the stairs, but she doesn't let go. I don't care, and push my way through the guys just standing there, like they were statues, frozen to the ground. A moment later, we are all outside, in front of the place. The guys just standing around, scratching their heads. My brother at least tried to help me comfort her, but she only moans and cries louder when he comes near, so they all kind of just backed off and left us alone for a moment. I managed to get her to loosen her monkey grip on me, and we all sit down in the tall grass, her on my lap with her arms around me under my arms and her face buried in the nape of my neck. And still, all she can do is sob and moan a bit. I tried to talk to her about what happened for a few minutes, but she just gets all panicky and says she wants to get the fuck out of there. All I wanted to do was oblige her, so I hollered at Joe to start up the van so we can head home. I tell Mark to call Mom and manage to get Katie to actually stand with me and walk to the van. We all pile in and are about to go when suddenly Katie starts to freak out again. She suddenly shouts wait, and we all look at her. I'm still holding her next to me, and she's still shaking all over, and she looks at me and says, "My purse." I'm a little confused at first, but then I realize what she had brought in with her. I had asked her why at first, and she showed me a little first aid kit inside, and a bunch of extra batteries. She had emptied out most of the other stuff she normally carried in it, but still had her wallet inside. She had told me it was our survival bag with a wink, pointing out a couple of condoms as well. At this point, I'm ready to leave the drat thing behind wherever she dropped it, because she clearly does not have it with her. She would have as well if her wallet had not been in it, I'm sure. But important stuff was there. Some cash, her social security card, her driver's license, the usual. She didn't want to leave any of that behind, or have to come back out here and get it later. She was getting much calmer by the minute, happy, I'm sure, just to be out in the sunlight again, but she refused to leave without the thing. Rather than argue with her, I hop out of the van and start making my way back towards the school, machete and flashlight in hand. I figured at least one of the other guys would follow me in, my brother maybe. I looked back, and they're all still sitting there in the van, staring at me, like I've got tentacles growing out of my eyes or something. I gesture at them to follow me, and Joe leans out the window and shouts, "She's your girlfriend, man. I ain't going back in there." Everyone else shares the determined to stay put look on their faces. By now, I don't really give a fuck. I haven't seen or heard anything weird, other than my girlfriend freaking the hell out, so I head back in. This is when I do actually begin to feel the heebie-jeebies. The whole place just felt oppressive. I didn't notice it at first, or brushed it off as my own internal worry for Katie. But halfway down the hall to the stairwell, around the same spot that I had previously heard what must have been the basement door slamming, it started feeling really bad. It was like a bad case of acid reflux or something. My stomach started churning, and I felt like I was still carrying Katie, like something was pulling down on my shoulders. Still, I persisted. It would take me no more than another 3 minutes to get down there, grab her purse, which was probably right where I had found her sitting, and jet out. Then I started thinking about the basement door. I hadn't really paid much attention to it before. I'd just sized up my surroundings, honed in on my girlfriend and forgotten about where I was for the sake of getting her out of there. But as I made that last little jaunt to the stairwell, it dawned on me that I had actually heard a door slamming. My mind just started to wander, and I tried to place it into a nice snug little box of logic. Maybe a door down the other end of the hall had been blown shut, or on a higher floor. The thing is, none of the rooms that any of us investigated had any doors on them. There were, of course, large metal and wooden cabinets in most of the classrooms, so surely it had been one of them. But my brain still insisted that this had sounded like a large door, not a cabinet, being slammed shut. And of course, the only real door I had seen so far was the one in the wall of the basement landing. I don't really consider myself some kind of tough guy or anything. Never been in a fight, not even with my brother. I get scared, just like anyone else I'd imagine. I can't stand deep water, even if I can see right to the bottom of it. In fact, that makes it worse. And spiders freak me out. But for whatever reason, I kept pressing on. Katie would not let it go if I left her stuff behind, and I'd likely have to make another trip out there to get it, just to make her happy. So I just kinda sucked it up and plowed forward. I resolved to get that purse so I could be rid of the place, and that was that. Screw the tension in my neck and the weight on my shoulders. The oppression of the place did not seem to lighten a bit as I mustered my courage, and I found myself at the top of the staircase, peering down into the gloom below. And the final part. This all took place in south-central Indiana, and really, that's as much as I want to say about the location. I start making my way down the steps, a little more carefully this time. The sound of the wood creaking under me is really noticeable now, without the screaming and sobbing to drown it out. I figure I'll be lucky if I don't slip this time on a well-rotted step, or patch of mold, or worse, step through the wood. I'm about halfway down, and moving the light around on the steps below me, not paying much attention to the landing below, so as to not lose my footing, when suddenly, the sound of the van's horn honking makes me want to climb the walls and shout bloody murder. Joe honks again as I realize what I'm hearing, and anger washes over me. Now I'm not scared at all, just pissed and off balance. I start moving down the stairs a little bit faster. I'm nearly to the bottom when suddenly I feel what must have been fingers pinch my Achilles tendon on my right foot. This time I actually do jump, because now something is screwing with me. It's not a car horn, or weird smell, or the weight on my shoulders. It's someone's fingers on the back of my foot. They were only there for a moment, but they pinched pretty hard, enough to bruise when I checked it out later. I thought I'd go toppling over, but managed to right myself and rush down the last remaining steps. I wheel around, and without much searching, find that there is a pretty good-sized hole between two steps a ways up, right where my foot had been when I got the pinch. The hole looks large enough for me to stick my own hand through, so I figure there has got to be someone down here with me. I sidestep towards the door to my left and shine the light on the wall of the descending staircase. Of course, there is a hatch there. However, it has a lock built into it. No handle or anything, just a flat little square door in the wall that previous tenants of the school probably stored something behind. I'm pretty amped up and starting to get scared all over again. The place really seemed to be pushing down on me once more, but I don't care if there is someone back there or not. I just want to grab Katie's shit and get out. So, I passed the light over the ground where Katie had been squatting. She was pretty close to the hatch actually, and there was nothing there but some leaves and twigs and debris, seemingly from past flooding. This is when I notice the door I'm standing next to is actually open, just a bit. It was enough to really get my blood pumping. I hadn't paid too much attention to it before, as I said above, but I had been pretty sure the thing was closed. And of course, I had heard someone slamming down here. Maybe it had been the hatch in the wall under the stairwell. To this day, I'm still not really sure. It could have been anything, but nonetheless, As I stood there in the murky light, cast from the vine-crowded windows above and the slight glare of my own flashlight, I couldn't help but feel truly pit of the stomach scared. I broke out in a cold sweat, staring at that door, wondering what the hell might be beyond it, and why Kitty's purse wasn't right here. I hadn't managed to get anything out of her before I trudged back in, other than her babbling about something on the other side of the very door I'm standing in front of. Again, I wonder if she had been talking about this door or the hatch. Regardless, I'm freaked, but I just stand there for a moment. I still need to find her damn purse, and I'm not quite ready to give up. I'm just overreacting, I tell myself. There is nothing down here but rotting wood and dripping pipes and a pile of leaves in the corner. Everything is cool. Find the purse and get the fuck out. So, I steel myself for a moment and finally reach out for the door. Slowly, I pull it towards me, shining the light around it as soon as I can. Thankfully, nothing jumps out at me, but the feeling of weights on my shoulders intensifies again. So for a moment, I just stand there with the door open, moving the light slowly through the room before me, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness ahead as best as they can. Clearly, this was some kind of maintenance room. I see brooms against the far wall, an ancient mop bucket with a molding mop in it next to a huge porcelain sink, covered in black cracks along one of the side walls to my left. To my right is a jumble of junk, a lot of it unrecognizable. The place looked like it had been inundated a few times, and I could only guess that the pile of stuff I was looking at was old decaying boxes of books. The place stank far worse than any of the other rooms we'd been in up until then. Without really thinking of anything but finding that damn purse, I move into the room quickly, shining my light to the left and right, ready for something to jump at me. Nothing does. This is when I notice the light coming from under the door on the far wall. Either my eyes adjusted to the gloom, or someone or something had actually just turned on a light on the other side of that door. It was really dim, and my immediate thought was that it had to be